All right, how are we doing? How are you, Tracie?
Doing well, thank you.
Yeah, we again. I thank you very much for being, for being on. It's an honor to have Tracie Harris from the Atheist Experience on my channel. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So I would like to start off by asking, kind of, what's your story? Did you grow up in a religious family? How do you think you became an atheist?
Yeah, my mother was raised Italian Catholic, and she converted over to a more, I guess, conservative brand of Christianity in the Protestant sector. My father, I think, had a lot to do with that. He was raised in a Protestant household, and after they were married, I know there was like a lot of contention with religion, and ultimately it ended up, like I say, in a very conservative leaning Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and she ended up Church of Christ. And by the time I was born, I was raised mainly by her taking me to church. So my father didn't really go to church anymore, but he definitely was up for arguing the Bible. Still seemed to be a believer. It was just, I think he had doctrinal differences with the church and just didn't really find a church that he agreed with or that he liked. He has trouble agreeing with anybody. And so she raised us very religious and very superstitious. She was like extremely into all kinds of, just not a very critical thinker. And so we weren't really taught to think critically. And I ended up anyway, I had a hard time believing. I was like a very good Bible student. I could learn the verses and sing the songs and everything I needed to do to sort of perform well and get the praise of the Sunday school teachers. I could do that. But I had a great deal of difficulty believing that a God existed. And so I spent a lot of time kind of buying into what I had been taught and thinking that if I just prayed hard enough and if I, participated enough and if I really, really was sincere, that ultimately, I would get that faith that I was supposed to have. And so I just kept trying and trying, which of course that's how it works, right? You get the impressionable child to just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. You just don't give up until what? Until you get whatever it is that is that thing that they don't really tell you what it is, that convinces you that you've gotten your sign or you've gotten your message from God or whatever it was you were supposed to get that, made you know that, yeah, okay, I'm solid now. And so I actually quit going to church for a while. And and of course I was still participating in this, in that, process that I had been sold on. So even though I wasn't going to church, I was still praying, I was still doing all these things but then what happened was the preacher called and they were having this class on evidences. And so he wanted me to come and participate in that along with some of the other students that were still there who were having trouble buying into it. And of course, in my mind, though, and it sounds ridiculous now that I think back about it, but at the time I thought, maybe this is God, like, reaching out to me, like he sent the preacher to come in. And it's like, of course, my mother's in contact with the preacher. She's clearly not going to be happy that her children aren't going to church. I'm sure that, he's concerned and looking for ways to make converts. And so there's nothing miraculous at all about the fact that the preacher would call me. There's nothing, miraculous. It's completely indoctrination that I'm sitting, at home every night praying and praying for some kind of a sign. Like, I don't want to go to hell and, I don't want God to hate me. And so it's just such a stacked deck that they give these children over to. And that ultimately, if you don't end up, I guess, going down the aisle and getting baptized at some point, that's almost would be the miracle, because you're so sold on it, and it's the only thing it's what you were raised in, and so you just buy into that entire process. So I did that, and I was really gung-ho. I mean, I was like the crazy Christian girl, and I was out proselytizing like everywhere I went. I was all inviting people to church. Oh yeah, anywhere I was right there, ready to talk about Jesus and annoy anybody to death with my religious views. And so I was really obnoxious. I mean, I look back now and I'm just embarrassed at what I was like. But at the time, I thought I was doing a good thing. So I ended up doing that for a while, for actually a pretty long time. And then there was a point where I did have difficulty with certain issues. And some of those issues were within the Bible themselves, and some of the issues were with the church rather than the Bible. So there were certain things, like points of the Bible that I thought the church was wrong about, where I thought this is what the Bible says and you're not really doing that. And when I would try to bring it up, it would get kind of dismissed. Nobody would really take it seriously. I would make the argument. They wouldn't really address the argument and just kind of say, oh, they would say something that didn't make sense. When I would try to question it further, it was just like, oh, no, we're done with this. And I was like, how can you be done with it when there's still questions and you really haven't resolved it? You haven't answered it. You're not really even understanding my criticism. And so it was a very frustrating experience, especially in a church where they believed strongly in like traditional sex roles and female submissiveness. And so you couldn't really get very far trying to talk to the men in that church. And that was one of the things I actually had problems with. There was like a point where one of the male instructors wanted me to come in and assist in teaching a class. And it was like a high school age group of students. I was right around the same age. And they felt like I should come in and help with the class because I was like really good. I mean, I was really good at quoting scripture. I was really good at understanding the doctrines, and had it all down pretty well. And so one of the men came and asked me if I would be willing to do it. The instructor himself was really into it. And then ultimately someone came to me very embarrassed and said, we have to decline the offer because one of the students in the class is male and he's baptized, which makes him like a member of the church, and you are not, allowed to be in a position of authority over a male in the church, and so you may not assist in the class. And I was especially confounded by this because this particular male I knew, and I also knew that the reason he had gotten baptized was because his parents expected him to, and he just had kind of put it off as long as he could. He didn't really care about any of it. He thought the entire thing was a joke. He was like, the pot smoking, partying, sex going. He was not buying into this church thing at all. It was just, I need to shut my parents up and keep everyone happy, so I'll just go get baptized. And so I found it weird because I would look at the scriptures that they were pointing at and I would think to myself, yeah, I mean, that is what it says. I mean, it really does say this. It says that I can't exercise authority, that I have to be submissive, that I have to be silent in the church. But at the same time, why would God make such an idiotic rule? Because here I am unable to teach a class where I could be really useful because of some idiot that doesn't even believe who ran down the aisle and got baptized to shut his parents up. And this is the structure that God thought was best. Yeah. Right? So it just seemed really ludicrous to me. All right. And I'm just like, this is completely, you'd have to be an idiot God to come up with a rule like that. And I kept thinking to myself, is it me, like I don't understand it, or is it just as stupid as what I'm seeing? Because this doesn't make any sense. And why would a God that knows so much be so stupid? And I couldn't grasp that. So I was having real problems with the doctrines. And at the same time, I had I'm going to just say like a friend, someone close to me, who was a preacher at another church, and he was engaged in something that was going on over there where he had been studying a particular brand of eschatology and been having trouble with the doctrines as well, basically saying there's a problem with the church's position on eschatology or end times. And the more he researched it, the more he started being troubled by the idea that the doctrines that the church was teaching around the end times were not aligned with whatever was in the Bible. It wasn't making sense. And ultimately, he started to look through some very old literature, and he got into like 17th century writing, Christian writings, and found finally like a couple of writers who had encountered the same ideas that he was having, who were saying this is an issue and this is a problem. And so then when he finally started to find the writers who were talking about it, he started to gain access to terminology, which allowed him to do more research. And he found more modern preachers who were into this. And then he started contacting them to network and find out, like, what is it that you are seeing, and what is it that, how do you handle this? And when they came back to him, it was kind of an interesting dialogue. So he then he decided to have a class at the church he was teaching at, and they had like a private study. And when they had the private study, the people that came were very open-minded, and they were very interested in what he was teaching. They thought he was onto something, and they were just like, this is actually very interesting. And the more they looked into it, after several months of having this class, the private class decided we should go ahead and have like a class within the church, like an official class within the church, because this sounds correct, and we may be teaching error, and so we would rather teach something that's correct. So they ended up moving this class into the church. And I don't remember now, because it was many years ago, if it was at the point that they started to have the class at the church, or if it was when he started to actually preach it from the pulpit. But when he started to present this idea to the broader congregation, that's when all hell broke loose.
Oh, hell.
Because there were a lot of people who had the view that it's not our doctrine, and so it's wrong. Whereas he was trying to say, our doctrines don't seem to make sense compared with what I'm seeing in these writings. And so our doctrines are wrong, which means that we should not be teaching them because that's an error. So we have to correct what we're teaching because it has to be correct. And even though I look back now and I don't see either of them as correct, because I don't believe that what's in the Bible is intended to be interpreted in any way as like a unified writing for us today, I still saw the merit, and especially at the time when I was still a believer, the merit in somebody saying, if our goal is to not teach error, then we need to align it with the scripture. And if we're not aligned with the scripture, then we need to stop what we're teaching. And when I saw the pushback in the church, people saying, but that's not our creed. So therefore we can't, it's wrong, we can't teach it. And I thought, whoa, but isn't our main creed that teaching error is wrong? Like, doesn't that supersede anything? That if you find out that what you're teaching is wrong, you have to adjust it. We always are talking about how we don't want to misrepresent what God wants us to tell people, that if this is God's word, we need to present it accurately. And now what you're saying is that if the word of God that you believe is the word of God says one thing, but your creed says another, you're going to go with your creed. How are you any better than the churches you condemn, like the Catholics or the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have these creeds that they stick to that are outside of the Bible? Which they would condemn. So I just was like, wow, this is very hypocritical. So it's interesting to me to kind of see this happening at a related, another Church of Christ that was right nearby. And so when I heard what it was he was teaching, it just clicked with me, like instantly. I was like, this makes so much more sense than what the church is teaching. And so when I got wind of it, and then found out there was this back channel among the churches that they were already spreading the idea that this person was heretical. And I was like, wait a minute, you haven't even heard him. The congregations don't even know this is happening. They don't even know this preacher's being blackballed. They don't even know why. They haven't had an opportunity to even hear what he has to say. And you're already like ostracizing him and basically trying to kick him out. And you're not even giving it a hearing. And it just seems so completely disingenuous and just completely dishonorable. I don't know how else to say it. It was like a dishonorable attitude. A person can be wrong and still be honorable. You know what I mean? But you can't be promoting something that you're saying, I don't care if it's error or not, and still maintain your honor. That's the point where you've just trampled on your honor. And so to me, the church was behaving in such a disrespectful, dishonorable, like just hypocritical way based on everything they'd ever tried to teach me. I just lost respect for them. But I was also having my own issues with trying to resolve things that were in the Bible that I just thought didn't make sense. So I started going off and I started reading up. I had run into this kid that was a Krishna at my university, and he was talking to me a lot about the Bible. And so I started reading more about how the Bible got put together, how the canon was created. And that was kind of when everything just collapsed for me.
Like
because
scribes and stuff like that. Like
yeah, when I realized that this guy was telling me things about how the Bible was put together, and I had studied the Bible like all my life, and I had never heard these things. And I thought, it's so weird that we're such a Bible thumping church, and I've never heard a class on how the canon came to exist. Like, never once have we studied that. It's like you would think that that would raise all kinds of question marks, but you just don't even think about it. It's something they don't talk about. It's something you don't think about. That issue never comes up. It's almost like the apostles wrote it all down and the churches just collected it all and they just slapped it all together in this really nice, neat package.
God was standing over
there. Yeah, making sure it was all good, and boom, there's the Bible. And that's it's like this weird impression that they give. They don't really ever come out and describe it that way, but you get that impression when you're going to church, that that's how it fell into place. But then when you start actually reading how it happened, and all the centuries and all the people involved and all the, it's like the writings and they don't know, and there's this, different versions of the and you're like, oh my gosh, what a train wreck, right? Yeah, what a train wreck. They're trying to decipher all of this stuff, and they're trying to make a book out of it, even though nobody has told them to do that. It's like the people that wrote the letters, the people that wrote these books of letters, they didn't ever say, and then collect it all together at some point and make a book that's going to be like the prescription for your religion. No one told anyone to do that. So it's just funny that people just did it, right? They just came out and did it on their own. And I started looking at that. I was like, holy cow, this is just a complete human production right here. That's all this is. And why in the world, how can I call this like the Word of God? This is ridiculous. Well, at that point, though, I was still on a mission for, truth about God. And so all of this fell apart, and I was just like, this is all error, right? That had always stuck with me. This is the error, and I need to know what the truth is. And so I'm going to go and find out, like, what is the truth about God? And so I spent about a decade just, like, delving into all kinds of different ideas, like whatever somebody had to put forward. What were these people saying? What were those people saying? Like even like Sufi Muslims, and looking into, Buddhism, like all different camps of Buddhism, and looking into, and that was, I had like several meetings with the preacher where I tried to talk to the preacher about this stuff. And there was one point, I was pretty nervous too. You're talking about like somebody that's I was probably teens or early 20s maybe. I was in college, so I guess I was probably, right about there, like 1920s or so. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to go meet with the preacher. He wants to talk to me about this before I leave. And by the time we got done, I had presented to him like everything that I was concerned about. And all he could say when I told him, like, how can you say with confidence that God had anything to do with putting the Bible together, after we had discussed it? And he said, I just have to have faith that God had a hand in it. And I'm like, wow, so you really don't have that smoking gun. There's nothing even in the Bible that you can point to say that it's justified to call this thing the Word of God. And you are still going to say that you're going to do that. Like, again, you don't even care if you're wrong. You don't even care if you're wrong. And you're going to get up there and preach it like it's true, while you're sitting here telling me you can't guarantee me that you know that that's true. That's just hypocrisy. And it's of the first order. It's just horrendous to me. And so I just couldn't take it anymore. It was horrible. When I walked out of there a free person, completely happy and completely solid on that decision. I didn't have any regrets leaving that church. And so then later, when I think you sent me this list of questions, and I think there was something in there about like fear of hell or whatever. Yeah. And what's funny is I never feared hell except in the time when I had reached an age where I thought there might be a God and I might be on the wrong side of God, and I had been taught to be afraid of hell as a consequence. So in those years when I was praying for a sign, that's when I was terrified of being wrong, and terrified that there would be a hell, and terrified that there was a God and I wasn't believing in it. And that's exactly how indoctrination is supposed to work, right? It's supposed to pressure you and make you pressure yourself. Even when you're in your room alone, you're sitting there terrifying yourself with these stories. And so I'm sitting there just pressuring myself to death. And part of that is the idea of an eternity in hell. And it doesn't even have to be the idea of like torment, right? It's just that concept of, oh, you'll be separated from this God who loves you.
Being in the wrong group, exactly.
And you'll be separated from your family, and you'll be separated. It's just this amorphous horror that they have put into your head to make you do everything you can do to coerce yourself into believing. And so, and it worked completely with me. It was exactly how it was supposed to work, and it worked. And when when I left the church, obviously the Bible had pretty much been torn down at that point. I mean, I didn't believe that at all anymore. And so all those doctrines that were in there were suspect. So the idea of hell meant nothing more to me than Jesus at that point, which meant nothing more to me than this is just some crap that people put together. I mean, it didn't really matter anymore. But it never occurred to me that maybe God was part of the pile of crap. You know, it was like in my head there was God, and then there was all this crap that these people had made. And so I'm still going looking for God. And but on that search for God was completely different because I didn't have fear, right? I was no longer afraid of hell. And what I thought at that point was, if there really is a God, and I'm looking at these people who, since I was a child, were telling me that I should be concerned about the truth, and they are complete hypocrites, right? And here I am, and I really am concerned about the truth. And I want to know, you know, if there's a God, it wasn't even an if at that point. Like in my head, it was like, there is a God. I want to know what it is. I want to understand it. I want to go out and find what is the truth about this God, and I want to do whatever is right by this God. And it wasn't even until later that I began to think, maybe there could be a God that doesn't really care if I find it, or that doesn't even, you know, isn't even interested in me finding it, that's not even paying attention. And at that point I thought, well, I still have nothing to lose, because in this search, right, nothing to lose as far as torment or afterlife. Because my thought was, if there's a God that cares, that wants you to be, you know, looking, I couldn't be more sincere. So any God that wants me to find it is going to see that I really am trying, and is going to give me what I need to get there. It's going to meet me that halfway and respect the fact that I'm really looking and really open to finding the truth. And any God that doesn't care, well, that God doesn't care. I'm probably not going to find it. I don't know. But I was like, there, you know, the idea of like a punitive, hateful, awful God to me wasn't even frightening, because there was nothing I could do with a God like that. It's like if you have a punitive, horrible, negative, hateful, wrathful, vengeful, violent God, there's no pleasing that thing anyway. So, you know, you're just screwed. So there was no point worrying about it. And that's the thing I think that got me, is there's different people, I take different paths. And so there are some people who, after they stop believing in God, they still sort of carry those doctrines with them, and they still have that fear of hell. So we hear from people it's a rare occasion, but we do hear from them. I can remember when I first started getting the mail at Atheist Experience, how it was very rare to get a letter from somebody that said they were afraid of hell. And I remember like the first one I got, and I was like, I've never heard of this before, like an atheist that fears hell. And obviously I didn't want to make the person feel weird. And I told them, I said, you know, it's like, I guess I can understand how it's indoctrinated into someone and it could really stick, you know, but try to remind yourself that if God cares about you, if there is a God and God does care about you, he's not going to send you to hell for something you can't help, which is not believing. So if he'll send you to hell for something you can't even change, that's a God you can't win with, right? You're not going to win, because he's just... Yeah. So there's no point even worrying about that God. If you're going to suffer for eternity, you're going to suffer for eternity. Could you even trust a God like that to keep his promise? You know what I mean? If he told you he would save you, would he? I mean, he's an asshole. So maybe he would save you, maybe he wouldn't. Maybe, you know, after you die, he'd be like, yeah, no, I don't know, I was just joking. Like, you go to hell anyway. Because he's just hateful. But anyway, I ultimately ended up at a point where I talked to so many people, mainly online. I was chatting away with all kinds of people. And finally, I just reached a point where I couldn't even explain what I believed in. I was just like, I don't even know anymore. When people are asking me about what do I believe and what do I think, and I can't even figure out what I'm trying to say this God would even be anymore. Like, I don't even know. It was just everything was so torn down after all those conversations. And I finally just thought, you know, well, God it'd have to be everything and nothing, and just, you know, it'd have to be encompass like whatever could be. And that took me about, I guess, not that much time before I was driving home one day, and I was like, well, God could just be like the universe, I suppose. And I looked it up online when I got home, and I found pantheists, and I was like, I guess that's the idea I just came up with, was pantheism, because I'm thinking God, if he's everything, he's the universe, and that's everything, right? I mean, that's what it means. It's the universe. It's the set of all things. So I was like, okay, and I guess I stuck with that for about a week, and then I just thought, hey, this is kind of like atheism, and so that's what I was like, oh, this is just atheism. It's just like another word for it. I just need to get rid of that label God. It's just meaningless. It's a redundancy for the universe. For me, anyway, that's what it was. And so at that point, I was just like, everything just went poof. And it was pretty instantaneous after that long and lengthy, lead up. The actual, what is it? Like the actual deconversion was pretty anticlimactic.
My story is kind of similar. I grew up a Roman Catholic, and I grew up in New Jersey, which is pretty tolerant. You know, all the churches would be in the same place, and everyone, we didn't usually argue about religion. Like sometimes the Protestants would, and Catholics would talk about good works and whether they're important, but everyone pretty much got along, and even with the other religions. And I just kind of went to church for the first 22 years or so, and I knew God was there, but I didn't put a lot of thought. I went to church. It was something I did, and then I had the rest of my life. And then I met someone who came up to me one day, actually a coworker, and informed me that I wasn't praying the right way. And then I started reading the Bible, and I was wrong about God, and everyone else was wrong. And if you didn't do what they said, you were gonna go to hell.
You met me, right? You met me that day.
Oh, we met. Oh, that was you.
Yeah.
But so, and then I started really reading it, and I had already been I was in college, and I had already known that like the printing press was made in, I think, about the 1400s to make books. And it occurred to me like maybe this was just made up, or maybe it's an exaggeration, or and whenever I would suggest that to this particular person, they'd get very angry with me, and then they'd come back with threats. And then I started doing some research, and I would talk to religious people, and I would notice, and this will be one of the questions, but I would notice, like, see, if you and I are talking about the Big Bang, if I say maybe I believe in a competing theory and you believe in the Big Bang, that's no big deal. We're not gonna, I'm not gonna say I hate you, but with religious people, if I say maybe that's not, the common thing I use is the Noah's flood or the Tower of Babel or Adam and Eve. If I would say maybe it didn't happen just like that, they usually, I would notice that the person would get angry and threaten me with hell, or I just didn't understand it. I love talking. If there's a God, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it wants. If someone wants to say that I'm wrong, I'm not going to get mad. And even my parents, and they're still Catholic, but they know people of other faiths. It's not a big deal. They don't get mad if you don't see it their way. I just never understood that. And somehow, maybe probably in 2012, I was always similar to you. I wanted to find out the truth of God, and I stumbled across the Atheist Experience, and I saw you and Matt, and I actually thought Matt was a jerk because the first couple of videos were of him insulting someone, but then I watched a little more, and I actually called, and then I met Matt, and he's a nice guy and everything.
He is a nice guy.
Could a God exist? Have you ruled that out as a possibility?
I don't even know how to determine whether or not it's possible. Like, what would be the parameters for a God existing? I have no clue.
Yeah, and
right? It's like saying, is it possible to build a house on this lot, right? What would you do? You'd have to examine the lot, right? You'd have to make sure that there was like material down there that you could do foundations. Would you have to put some piers down there? Like, how would you build a house on this lot? Not every lot is buildable. You could have you could go down there and say, oh no, this is like swampy underneath, right? So in order to determine if it's possible, you'd have to make some evaluation of what's required in order to put the house there, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you couldn't make an assessment whether or not it's possible. So when someone asks me, is it possible for a God to exist? My question is, what are the requirements? I don't know.
Yeah. I would have to think of. I mean, responsible for a being that set the Big Bang in motion. I mean, that's one thing, or maybe we just don't understand it, which of course means we shouldn't believe in it yet.
Right, but I mean, I can't make a determination of whether or not it's possible unless I know what is required in order for it to exist, and I don't know what that is.
I'll have to think about that. I'll have to get back to you. If you could talk to your own self, like I guess when you were a Christ believer, and you were you were really into it. If you could talk, if I could like bring the old you here, how do you think that conversation would go? What would you try to say or whatever?
There were like a few. The best I can do is there were a few people that impacted me, somewhat, and made me realize that I wasn't really thinking clearly by presenting me with certain things that, I guess allowed me to see that I was compartmentalizing particular religious views and not really putting that into, like, integrating it with other ideas that I understood as true, that when they were together, they didn't make sense. And so every now and then somebody would present something like that to me where they would say, I remember one time in church, they taught us that there were ocean fossils on mountaintops, and that was proof of the flood. And so I remember bringing this up to one of my friends who said, you do realize that a lot of mountain ranges used to be underwater, right? Like, you know this, right? And I was so embarrassed because I did know that. I mean, I had taken, basic earth sciences in school, and we had learned how the mountains had pushed up, and, these ranges come, things would be underwater, they would come out, and you'd have collisions. The mountain ranges on the coast are formed differently than mountain ranges through glacier flows, and there's like different ways that mountains form. And that's the other thing, you get glaciers that come down that carry all kinds of frozen, ocean. And so when I thought for just a moment, I was so embarrassed by the fact that something so obvious had not even entered my head the entire time I was accepting this proof of the flood, that I could have just simply not ever thought, oh, well, but this is how mountains form, even though I had been taught that and I knew it. And having conversations like that, I think, had an impact on me. It wasn't sufficient. It was tiny impacts. They were small dents, but they allowed me to understand that there was something wrong with the way I was thinking in regard to religion, that I didn't think maybe as well as I should, or as well as many other people did. I had real trouble with critical thinking.
That's interesting. What stereotypes about atheists or atheism do you want to confront and correct?
Oh, all of them. I don't like the idea that all atheists, it's funny because it doesn't even matter if the stereotypes are accurate or not, because they seem to be prescribed rather than observed, right? So I think most people who are into the atheist stereotypes are people who kind of already know they're not true, and they just sort of throw them out there to goad people. There's people that sort of know this is that these are the wrong things to say. It's almost like throwing down, racial epithets to people who, if you're trying to get a rise out of somebody and you're a racist, you know exactly what to say, right? That's going to be nasty and ugly. You're a racist, of course you know. And so these people, these theists who are pretty much just, trying to bait people, I think, are the ones that are mostly responsible for the stereotypes. But they don't really care what's true, right? They don't care if it's true or not. They just care that they want to be able to tell you that this is how you have to be. So they'll say to you things like, well, if you're an atheist, then you can't have any meaning in your life. You can't. And so they're trying to tell me. They're telling somebody whose life is full of meaning that I can't have meaning. Right, and it's ludicrous. It's just really ridiculous. It's like walking up to an NBA player telling him he can't be tall. I mean, you're looking at it. So whatever. I mean, you're being ridiculous, and you're just standing here trying to tell me what I can and can't be, which has no actual impact in what I am and am not. It's just you simply voicing your wishful thinking. But the problem is that you voice it loud enough and long enough so that other people tend to feel that it's okay to denigrate me and to denigrate my demographic. And it's not okay. It's one thing if one person wants to be an asshole. It's another thing if a lot of other people are going to hear that and believe it because no one else stands up against it. And so that's part of the reason I think for activism is the idea that like, for example, talking about meaning, right? You have Chris Johnson, who is an atheist who just did the project A Better Life, meaning in the lives of atheists, and it's this really nice project that he worked on. And the whole point to it was to address this idea that that atheists are joyless people with no meaning in their lives, and they don't love anything. And he was just like, this is such a load of crap. And all it really would take is somebody just showing that it's false. I mean, it's so demonstrably false. All you have to do is go out and start meeting some atheists, and you begin to realize that, oh, this is a really diverse group of people. You know, are there atheists who are joyless and hateful and mean? Yeah, sure. Are there Christians who are joyless and yes, absolutely. And are there atheists who are happy and have lots of joy and lots of meaning and who are in there really participating with their life? And of course, obviously, you know, and it takes almost nothing to find them. All you have to do is be willing to look. But we've got a situation in the country right now where in many pockets of the country, you can't even say you're an atheist. You know, we still get letters from people who, you know, we'll get letters from educated professionals. I'm a doctor and I work in this small town. And if anybody knew I was an atheist, I would lose my practice. I'd never get another patient. So you have these situations where people are afraid to say I'm an atheist. And so you have this little town, this community where they probably all go into the doctor. They love their community doctor. He's such a great guy. But you tell him he's an atheist and he's going to be ostracized, right? So how does he come out to say, I'm a happy guy that you would like, and I'm an atheist? Now, it would do a lot of good in the sense of like PR to have that person who is well-liked be able to come out into the community and say, you like me, I'm an atheist, you think I'm a good guy, but he can't even get that far, right? He can't even get his foot out the door because he knows what's going to cost him to even step out the front door. So for the people like me who are in situations where you can be out, where you can kind of identify as atheist, it becomes very important to do so because by stepping up and saying, I'm not perfect, but I'm a decent person, and I'm an atheist, and I don't think I'm unlovable. I don't think that I don't love people. I don't think that I'm uncaring. I don't think that I'm not charitable. I think I have meaning. I get joyful and happy. I care for kittens and babies, and and at the end of the day, if somebody's trying to say that I can't exist, I'm here to show that they're wrong. I do exist. I'm an atheist, and I'm happy.
That's good. That's very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting. Do you guys feel that like you're digging yourselves out of a hole, kind of like someone told me one time, I think even some of the atheist activists like Seth MacFarlane said he thinks they're 300 years away from having it be normal or something. I mean, I don't know how we determine that, but it does seem like a very uphill battle and everything.
I guess it depends on where you live. You know, it really does. I mean, obviously, if I lived in like some Sharia law country, I'd probably be more years away from it. But it really just depends on where you are. I hate the idea that it's so easy to denigrate atheists. I mean, it's just such a simple thing, and nobody seems to care. You know, it's sort of a demographic where if you do say, hey, I'm being unfairly denigrated, there's so many people who are just like, oh, just, shut up. Just shut up and sit down because who cares? You're an atheist, right? It's okay to hate you. It's not like you're black. It's not like you're, whatever. You're not gay. You're not, you're an atheist. And it's almost this idea, weirdly, like I think it's part of this as it being okay. It's strange to me. Prejudice does not mean that you unfairly judge people who are in a situation they cannot help. You can unfairly judge a group of people who are in situations that they choose to be in. I can unfairly judge any group. Just because they're not one of the legally protected anti-discrimination groups doesn't mean it's okay to be prejudiced. You're still being unreasonable by prejudging people due to an association when your judgment is not tied to that association, right? So, for example, I will see people who are, the best example I can give is police. I find that there's like huge amounts of discrimination against police. And even saying that, I get all kinds of like angry response to even point that out, that there are some people who feel like it's okay to denigrate police because they don't like what certain police officers do. And so instead of saying that the people that take the job because they need a job, it's to protect and to serve. They are community servants. They are our employees. They work for us. Their job is law enforcement. And are they all good? No. There's such thing as bad cop. There are cops that do things that are not okay. But when somebody takes the group that is doing something that is not part of the job and is not what you sign on to when you put on that uniform, and then they try to say this is what it represents, anybody that's wearing that uniform, well, you're being unreasonable. That's irrational. That's a prejudice. It's an irrational prejudice. It may or may not be as damaging as discrimination against legally protected demographics, but it is every bit as unreasonable. It is every bit an irrational judgment. So you have something like that. When it comes to atheism, you've got a similar situation where religious people have convinced so much of the world that you signed on to be an atheist, that you choose not to believe. Well, because you have to. I mean, for the Christian to say that God is justifiably condemning you to hell, he has to say you've done it to yourself. You can't say that you can't help what you believe or don't believe. You chose to believe or not believe, and so God is fair to treat you however he treats you. He can judge that, right? If it was like if you were born with one leg, God's going to send you to hell, everybody would say, oh, wait, that's really unfair. I mean, you're just born with one leg and God sends you to hell. But somehow they've convinced people that if you can't bring yourself to believe a thing, no matter how hard you tried, it's your fault you don't believe it. It's not that you're not convinced. Belief is in their heads, they try to promote belief as something you choose. But if you ask them what would convince them there's no God, they'd be like, oh, nothing could ever convince. Okay, well, then you're telling me that this is a choice for you? No,
maybe they should
you don't choose this belief.
Maybe they should call it conclusions instead of beliefs. I don't know.
Well, whatever they want to call it. I always use the example, if I brought you up to a skyscraper and told you to believe that you can float down safely, would you jump?
Right.
Of course not. You can't believe that. You cannot make yourself believe things, no matter how much you would like to. If you were going to shove me off that building, I would love to believe I wasn't going to fall on the ground and, splatter. But no matter how much I want to believe it, I am too convinced that I'm going to hit the ground. There's no way that I couldn't force myself to believe otherwise. And so belief is not this turn it on, turn it off thing that you have control over. But they have to teach it that way because otherwise God is unjustified in condemning you for what you don't believe, right? I mean, that would be unfair. So you have to be responsible for what you believe. So they teach that you chose it. And in doing so, we become a demographic of people who are just choosing to be, ungodly, which is weirdly tied to immoral, right? Wicked, evil, hateful, distrustful, like you name it. We're basically, by choosing to not believe in God, we have given ourselves license to answer to no one, right? Because they don't believe in humanity, okay? They believe in God. So if you're not answering to a God, they don't understand why you would bother to even get along with anyone anymore. It's like,
right,
well, maybe because
banks, right?
Yeah, existing in society, isn't to them sufficient pressure to conform to being like a decent person. Just the idea that you might want to be decent, that we have innate, evolved responses that allow us to appreciate when other people like us, right? I mean, we're happy when we're liked, when we're loved. When babies are happy when they're picked up, when they're held. When you don't hold them and they aren't held and they sit in an orphanage for 3 months, they don't develop well. So human beings want to interact. They want to be social. They want to get along. We are like that innately, but that's not what religion teaches, right? I mean, religion teaches that we're horrible and that left to our own devices, not threatened with hell and not threatened with all kinds of things, we're going to be awful, rapists, murder. That's what a human being is naturally. And it's like, no, that's kind of the opposite. That's like a messed up human being. That's what happens when you mess somebody up. That's not how people are born. Innately, we are social animals, which means that we are evolved to get along. We're not evolved to hurt each other and damage each other and, prey on each other and victimize each other. That's not what we naturally do. When you see that happening, that's an aberration, not the norm. But that's, again, something they have to teach otherwise. They couldn't possibly come forward saying people are good, because then what are we being saved from?
They want to make it that you need something, right?
Yeah, you're horrible. You're worthless. You're terrible. You're nothing. You are just like a complete train wreck without God. Yeah, you're wretched. Exactly.
I want to ask some questions about the possibility of there being an afterlife. You've talked about on the show, I think you talked to someone about dealing with the fact that you're going to be dead, and
Yeah.
it's a hard thing. It's a hard. Um, if there was an afterlife, say you and I know we have a mutual friend, he's a nice guy, and he
Okay.
dies tragically, and say there's a possibility that he's actually, even though he died here, he's somewhere else and he's comfortable. I mean, is that appealing at all?
That you just keep living only somewhere else?
Yeah, you go somewhere else instead of just being dead.
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you get to be young again? And I guess it depends on the nature of the afterlife, on whether or not it would be appealing.
Right. Say it was maybe not what we were taught in church, but like, we both kind of grew up with Christianity. We're familiar with thinking that there's this heaven. If there was something, say it was, whatever, you got to be young again, or it was comfortable and you had all your needs met and you could see your dead relatives, does that sound appealing?
Depends on the relatives. But I think, sure, I guess another chance to do it again, especially if I know what I know now, if the rules are pretty similar and I'm not having to relearn everything. I mean, there's definitely, a context in which the idea of, living longer than you do, I suppose, would be an interesting thing. I don't tend to worry about it or compare it a lot. Like, I guess I don't look at it as something that is lost. I'm kind of okay with life as it is. The questions about, well, could it be better or could it be this or that? I mean, obviously there's some people for whom this life is like a complete nightmare, right? I mean, there are people living in conditions where they'd almost be better off dead, where their lives are going to be another 5 years of misery before they are dead. And for somebody like that, I would think, another chance at life would be greatly appealing. You know what I mean? It's almost like for my own life, I've had a pretty good life, and I don't know, I'm good with it, I suppose. I don't think that I wouldn't sit here and say, oh, I love getting older. It's really nice when I have aches and pains when I wake up in the morning. But at the same time, I mean, I imagine that you could only live so long before you would just get finally tired of it. And I don't know. I don't know how long that would be, but if you kept being able to stay young, it seems like anything would get boring after a while.
Yeah. The idea of there being the punishment after death, I usually use the term like whoever's, people wrong each other all the time, and a lot of people get away with it, pickpockets, and there are even murderers who have gotten away. And I mean, there are murder mysteries that we could look into where the killer was never caught. So they got away with it. Would it be better if there was maybe not an eternal punishment, but some type of punishment after death? They had to...
What's weird is I've never really been that down with punitive responses, right? I don't really like the punitive response. It's sort of an after-the-fact measure that does no good. The real benefit to it, I guess, is if you really want revenge on somebody, you might feel better seeing them suffer, if that's your personality. But I would say, like, for example, if somebody, like, if they said to me that someone like Ted Bundy, that they had a pill that they could give him, and in the morning when he woke up, he would no longer be psychotic, he would no longer wish to harm anybody, he would be a productive member of society, he would never relapse, he would no longer be a murderer and a rapist. Would I rather have Ted Bundy spend his remaining years being a productive, helpful member of society, or would I rather see him put into the electric chair?
That's a good point.
If we had the choice.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you rather see him fixed than punished? Like I say, I understand the desire for victims' families or whatever, whatever a person who's been the victim or been related to a victim. I have no judgment there. Like, as far as some people will have a heinous thing happen like that and they'll be like, I forgive the person. And it's so hard to understand that. But that's what they do, and that's how they deal with it. And then you have somebody else who is just like, I want to see them pay forever. And you can understand that too. It's sort of like, okay, I understand where they're coming from. And I'm not saying that I don't understand those feelings. But at the same time, from like a social justice perspective, when I look at the idea of what is the purpose of justice, what is the role of law, and what is what should we as a society want to do with our members? Should it be about making things better, or should it be just about vengeance? And I tend to think that if we had the magic pill, I would be advocating for employing it, and I would be working my hardest to help people understand that this was a very sick individual with a messed up mind who needed help and did some very bad things before he was caught. But yeah, if we could undo the damage in his mind, I would be all for that.
That's great. That's very interesting. Because I've studied some Ted Bundy and some of the individuals. I was a psychology major, and it's very interesting to maybe they could make it that it didn't happen again or whatever. When people talk, we kind of touched on this earlier. We've both experienced, like, I've seen people give credit to their good moral character. They give credit to the Bible, right? Like
Sure.
They'll say, I do the right thing because of the Bible, or
Right.
a common thing like I'm going to wait to have sex until marriage because of the Bible. Now, this is very intriguing because obviously the Bible has a lot of interesting stuff in it. Sometimes you guys have pointed out slavery and murders and all types. So why
Sure.
would someone accredit their good moral character to the Bible?
Well, it's interesting because you use the example of waiting until you're married to have sex, which I consider to be a negative. I don't consider that a moral thing at all. I think it's a dehumanizing perspective that the church has sold. Anytime somebody wants to put forward that humans, let's say people should behave in a particular way that is antithesis to innate human behavior, that is the definition of dehumanizing, right? You are basically condemning what it is to be human, and you are saying that it would be better if we weren't humans and we didn't act like humans. And so in my mind, that is a hateful, like, anti-human, like, dehumanizing attitude that I find repugnant. And when people try to say that abstinence from sex is like a better way, my response is they hate their own humanity. Right. And it's the same with any doctrine. It doesn't have to be religious. It could be outside of religion, and there are some that are still religiously rooted but have gotten secular lives. And whenever I hear that, I just say to myself, that is dehumanizing, and you are anti-human. And when I see people say that human beings are actually evolutionarily, you can, from an evolutionary standpoint, you can demonstrate that human beings should be having much more sex than they have. And the idea that we should not have sex or that we should be in monogamous only relationships is completely antithesis to everything about the evidence of what a human being should be and should be doing. We restrict ourselves in artificial ways for very poor reasons in order to maintain an attitude that limited sexuality is somehow morally superior, which to me is like completely wrong.
Yeah, and everything. Well, like with the Bible, like someone will say, like, I do the right thing because of the Bible. Did you have any thoughts on that? Like, I mean, because it just really confused me because
well, that's part of what I'm saying. Though, is part of it is that the Bible sells this quote morality that's not even moral. It sells you on this dehumanizing kind of morality. It basically says that these are, you're wrong to think lustful thoughts. Really? Isn't that normal?
That's how people come about.
Right. I'm so moral because I sit here and restrict myself from being a human being. Well, that's not how you gauge morality. But it is if you believe that human beings are completely evil and depraved and reprobate, right? If everything about your humanity is completely vile, then it becomes true that the less human you are, the more moral you are, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So when I look at it, it's like, to me, morality should be gauged by what is human. How a human should behave should be gauged by what is innately human and what can be demonstrated to be innately human. And if it's not innately human, then I don't know where you're getting that rule. How are you applying that to what a human should be like? Where's your metric? Where's your framework? Where is the template that you're using if it's not a human being when you're trying to figure out what a human being should do?
So what people probably ask you, like, so even if we could conclude that there is no God, right? where do we get our morals from? How do we go about deciding what's moral?
All social species develop responses that help them to integrate with other members of their own species. So there is every indication that morality is interspecies, right? Yeah, that, or I guess it's intraspecies. That you share your morality with other members of your species, other members with which you can communicate and form social bonds in a way that allows you to consent mutually to what you're doing. And you can't really share that outside your species. I can't enter into a contract with a cat. I can own a cat, but the cat can never consent to being my cat. It can't understand the relationship. It can't understand that social interaction, that type. It will never be an equal partner in that connection because we cannot communicate on that level. I cannot ask the cat's consent. So if I want to have a cat in the house, basically it's property. And when it comes to other people, we can communicate. I can express what is okay, what is not okay, what I accept, what I don't accept. And we can make social commitments to each other, social obligations. And so we have these feelings that actually develop. And other species have these, and they share them within their own species as well, right? So we're not the only species with moral metrics, but you can't even take two moral species and put them together and form an interspecies morality. It doesn't work because they can't communicate on that level. So these species all have their own little intraspecies morality that happens, right? So you've got chimpanzees and they work out their chimpanzee society. And you've got human beings and we work out our human societies. And you have dogs and they work out their packs, their societies. And they have these rules and they enforce the rules, right? I mean, they have things that are okay and not okay to do. And when one of them does something that's not okay, they will enforce that. They will change that behavior. They will, adjust it, immediately respond to it. And so you have things like, one of the most interesting things to me is the idea of fairness, right? Fairness that is tested. When you test fairness in a dog, what you find out is that when a dog performs in a lab, when you teach it a task and you give it a treat for a task, if you have two dogs that are performing and one of them gets a treat when they do the task, the other one doesn't, the one that doesn't get the treat will begin to not cooperate.
Wow.
So that dog has a sense of fairness. He basically, or she basically, is looking at the other dog and saying, when they perform the task, they get a treat. When I'm performing the task, I'm not getting the treat. I'm not performing the task anymore.
Interesting.
They start to misbehave in that situation. What they also found is that when you do treat them both, when they both do the trick and they both get treated, they will both perform. This will still occur if you treat one better. So if I'm giving one steak and I'm giving the other kibbles, they don't seem to care as long as they both get a treat.
Yeah.
So the dog's sense of fairness is more around the idea of I got something. But when you get to chimpanzees, they care about what you give them.
Oh, wow.
So if he gets this and I got that, and that's not as good as that, then I'm not going to do the trick anymore. Because I want the banana, not the cucumber, right? And so the chimpanzee has a more developed sense of fairness where he starts to actually judge the payoff, to say, I didn't get as much of a payoff here. This is not cool. And this is more along the lines of how people look at each other. Right? So you have the idea that people, with human beings, we're the same way. If you find out your coworker doing the same job is making $10,000 a year more than you, you're going to be pissed. So that's not going to be okay. Right? Wait a minute, I'm doing the same job. How come he's making that much more? Right? How did he negotiate that? So this is not something that you're going to be able to test in something like a wolverine, right? A non-social animal is not going to sit there and do your tricks and take your treats and worry about whether the other wolverine is getting treats or not treats. Non-social species don't care. They are very, very more into the idea of the individual, and this is just this myopic view of them. They only come together and interact in a very limited way for breeding, for territorial disputes, fights. Yeah, we're traveling around in packs. They aren't getting along. They aren't hanging out and socializing, right? But humans are social. Dogs are social. Chimps are social. And we also have species that we have bred to be more social, so that we can look at them before they were social and as they are more social, and we can see that these metrics of fairness and empathy and equity and compassion and obligation begin to develop as you breed the thing to be more social. Okay, so when you take passive animals from an aggressive, antisocial species and you breed them, you get a more social version of that animal that then has these metrics. It wants to be around others of its own species. It wants to be around, and it wants to socialize, and it develops better communication. And the test for that was most clear wasn't even really a test for it. It was an accidental discovery, but it was the silver fox experiments. And what happened at the end of that was you had an animal that didn't really make much noise other than snarling and attacking, and you had something that actually made like barks and yips, and you had something that could tail wag. So you actually developed something from this other species that allowed that could communicate with a greater capacity. So that what you're seeing is it's heading toward interaction with other members of its own species now. So you're developing a social animal from a non-social. Well, I don't say non-social, but from a very limited social. An animal that comes together to breed and fight is now seeking out companionship with its own species over here after like several generations of breeding. So you can breed these moral metrics. And this is what they, when they look for morality, this is what they're looking for. Does this species have a sense of fairness? Does it have a sense of empathy? Does it have a sense of equity? Will it show compassion? Does it get distressed if we torture another member of a species, right? I mean, it's brutal, but they can see whether or not an animal is getting stressed out by watching another, member of the species being distressed. So you can tell whether or not that animal empathizes, right? Is it empathetic? And so by doing this, we learn that, first of all, you can breed a social species, right? It's an evolved, socialness can be evolved. And then what we learn is that that the social species carry with them moral metrics, all of these inherent interactions like obligation, guilt, empathy, equity, fairness, compassion, all of that goes into what makes up our morality is evolved. So when people say, where does your morality come from? It's pretty clear in my mind where morality comes from.
So it's kind of innate. It's like you said. It was very interesting, those experiments. I had never heard of that. I'll have to look into that and everything. When we talk about the future, sometimes it seems that things are getting better. The world is kind of, I guess, evolving, as you would say, or we're kind of moving forward. We're learning new things. But at the same time, sometimes, particularly when I look at a nation like Pakistan or India or Iran, and granted, I don't spend time there, but it seems like there are very intolerant people, maybe millions or hundreds of thousands of intolerant people,
or with our own Republican elections yesterday.
Even here sometimes. I mean,
yeah.
So the question is like, do you think things are getting better or worse?
I don't even know. I don't know. It's a hard question after those elections last night to answer that, because it's like I don't know. I would hope. As an atheist, it's a scary thing to see like such a Republican sweep, right? And especially as a woman, like as a woman and an atheist, that is terrifying. Because these are people that are religious zealots in a large part, right? I mean, they're not just fiscal anymore. They're not just fiscal conservatives. They are social conservatives, like to the max. And these are people that don't understand the problem with religious intrusion in schools. They don't understand why it's an issue that you should have to deal with religion in your workplace. They don't understand. They just see the religious privilege in them is so strong. They're so blinded to it. And it's almost like I want to say, ask me in 4 years whether it's going to be better or worse. Because I see these people as religious bullies who want to force people to live their religious paradigms, whether you choose that religion or not, right? They're going to make sure you live it. no woman is going to have, a right to do anything outside of that religion. She's going to be denigrated and vilified should she decide to not be chaste. She's going to lose her, just physical autonomy, clearly, under the issue of abortion. They just simply have no regard or respect for anything that's non-religious and non-male. And I don't know what is going to happen. I don't know. I mean, there were a lot of initiatives that came through last night that were liberal, which is really a weird mix to me. Several states that voted for more, greater legalization of drugs, what are current illicit drugs. There were states that hiked their minimum wage. There were all these democratic initiatives that went through, and yet there were all these Republican wins. And I look at that, and it's I don't even know how to interpret that. To me, that's almost psychotic, right? The idea that you'd have 4 states legalizing marijuana, you'd have several states upping their minimum wage. You would, and one state increase their gun regulations. Okay. And it's just okay, well, that's not a Republican thing, right? I mean, that's completely anti-Republican. So I don't know how all these weird, initiatives went through that were so non-Republican, and yet every representative, every state went red.
Yeah,
and I'm I don't even know what that means.
I was watching yesterday. I was pretty surprised as well. What if this is someone's first day? I must have had a first day. What I mean is someone is religious and they go to church, they pray and they live their life. And maybe today happens to be the first day they're thinking, gee, is there really a God? Is my religion right? What should they do? Is there something they should read? Is there?
I think the first thing they need to do is to set themselves free to at least ask questions, right? So the first thing you should do, in my opinion, is ask yourself whether you worship a God who would punitively punish you for actually trying to find answers to questions. If your God is real and your God exists, and you're going to discover that because you will out the truth, right? The truth will out. Will your God be angry at you for simply going and looking and asking questions? Is that the God you worship that would punish you for that? Or is it a God that you think would be understanding and allow you to go and investigate and make yourself feel better by finding these answers? And so my thing is, first of all, try to find some way to grant yourself permission to ask questions so that you're not afraid. Don't be afraid while you're asking questions. Fear, nothing distorts your perceptions and your judgment like fear. It will really mess your head up. So whenever you're trying to make a decision, think about it, right? When you go in to buy a car, right, what do? It's oh, well, this offer is not going to last. This is only today only, right? So you got to put some kind of pressure on. You got to put some kind of fear on to try and make the person make a decision that they would normally want to have more time to make. They would want to think about it a little bit more, right? Anytime you can amp up the pressure, anytime you can put some kind of fear to try to push somebody to make a decision right away, or to, don't want you to think too much about this. I don't want you to think too long about this because you might not do it. Don't go look around at the other lots because I don't know, you don't want the person to consider. And that's the first thing people need to understand is that first you have to just banish the fear out of your head. You're not going to think clearly, and you're not going to question clearly, and you're not going to interpret information clearly and look at the answers clearly unless you can actually look at them without pressuring yourself and being afraid of what you might find. So you find what you find and you accept it. And if your God is real and you're making an honest search, then you should find your God, and this should not be a problem. And if you don't find your God, then you should start thinking that maybe that's a little bit telling, but don't be afraid of it. Whatever you find, you should just be okay finding. If you're scared of what you might find, then maybe it's not time to start looking yet for you.
That's really what I started to wonder, is this person telling me the truth, or are they telling me, are they speaking from authority and trying to get me to do what they want rather than sometimes you guys have been critical of religious organizations. Should we maintain religious freedom, and why?
I don't think that you have much choice. I think when you try to outlaw religion, it's never pretty. And that would be why I wouldn't outlaw it. Because you can't really control what people believe. You can't restrict it by law. And when a person, to me, violating someone's conscience is, I have to be careful there are certain ways that I would phrase this, but I'm afraid that it would be like too incendiary. So I'm just going to say that it is a horrible violation of a human being to violate their conscience. To make somebody do a thing that they are telling you they cannot do, or to stop them from doing something that they feel they must, should only be done in circumstances where it is completely objectionable and where it cannot be tolerated if they act or do not act. So, in my opinion, if someone believes that they must do something or they believe that they must not do something, and this is not a hardship on society to the degree that it's not violating me, then I am going to say that I would do what I could to allow it. For example, there are people who, even with things like drafting people, for example, into military service, we have the idea that you have to allow for a conscientious objection. You cannot hand somebody a gun and tell them they must kill people. There are simply people who cannot do this. And there are, to force someone to kill a person who is incapable, who has expressed to you, I am not capable of doing this, to me is probably one of the worst things you could do to a person. And anytime you have a situation where you're violating someone's conscience, they are put in a situation that's impossible. When I'm being told I have to do something that I cannot do, or I'm afoul of the law, you are putting me now in a really desperate situation where you're basically saying I violate myself or I violate the law. And when you look at places like fascist nations, for example, that have done some really heinous things where they've asked citizens to participate or military people to participate in things that were really horrific. The idea that a person would be that pressured to do a thing that they're thinking, I can't do this to other people, and yet if I don't do this, I'm going to be killed or I'm going to be facing consequences. Look at the doctors in Ireland, for example, that sat and waited while that poor woman was sick. She was pregnant. She was infected, and they didn't want to do the abortion because they were afraid, because the laws were so ambiguous. They felt that they would be up on charges if they were to intervene at the wrong time, if they didn't give it enough time, if they didn't try. And so what ultimately happened is she died, right? Because the doctors were afraid to act. And some of them felt like they should act, but they felt like, if I do act, what if I act and I save her, and then I end up losing my license over this or going to jail or prison for this? That to me is a completely heinous thing to do to a person. To put a doctor in that situation, to say you either have to let her die or you have to risk your license and risk your freedom. How is he supposed to respond to that, or she?
Yeah, I didn't hear about that one. I'll have to look into that one.
Yeah, it was pretty horrible. I think she was Indian. Her and her husband were Indian, and they were living there, like he was working there, and she ended up, something went wrong with the pregnancy, and then she ended up infected, and they didn't intervene in time, and she died. And the laws in Ireland around abortion are very, very restrictive, and the doctors expressed fear. They were just like, we weren't sure whether or not, it was okay to intervene. And to have to sit there and watch somebody die while you're afraid that you'll be breaking the law to save their life, while you have all the facilities and the knowledge to save them, it's very easy to say, well, you're a doctor, you should have just helped her. But at the same time, I'm not the one facing prison charges. I'm not the one, looking at losing my entire practice. That to me puts a person in a situation that's impossible. There's a no-win situation there for them. They lose either way, and that's completely unfair to do to a human being.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that too. That I haven't. That must have been recent. In Tajikistan, I think I didn't explain that question correctly, but in Tajikistan, they had an interesting situation. Now, Tajikistan is a country in East Asia, kind of near Afghanistan, and the government is relatively secular, but they do have a lot of hardcore fundamentalist Muslims in their country, and they actually took steps to um, regulate religion. Like, you're not allowed to have public displays of religion. I think they don't want children going to mosque until a certain age. They don't want girls to wear the scarves until they're at least like 18 or 21 or something. Is something like that appropriate? Is it something that maybe they, like, what's your take on that?
I wouldn't support it. I mean, what they do is what they do. The laws they have are the laws they have. But if somebody were putting it to a ballot, I wouldn't vote for it. Yeah. I think that people have to be free to do what they're going to do as long as they're not causing a public disruption.
Do you have any friends that are religious? Is that an issue?
Oh, yeah. I think it's impossible to live in the United States and not have friends that are religious. So yeah, and I don't think I have. I mean, I can't think of anybody close to me who is regularly practicing. I know a lot of people that either believe. I would say most of the people I know would be very non-practicing believers, or what I would call maybe like an agnostic person. You know what I mean? Like they might think that there's something, they don't know quite what it is, they couldn't really describe it for you in any kind of detailed way. I probably have some friends who would identify with the spiritual, not religious kind of bent.
I know you guys love that.
Yeah, but I think it just comes from a lot of people just don't think about it. So they have this kind of weird amorphous attitude toward it, which is sort of like, yeah, maybe there's something, and sometimes I think there is, and I don't know, I guess there could be, and they're very, very wishy-washy, but most of the time it's just they haven't thought about it. Yeah. And they don't put a lot of thought into it. And so when it does come up, they don't really have a strong opinion. It's just sort of yeah, maybe, I don't know. And that's, I think, probably most of my friends that don't identify as straight atheists would probably fall into some kind of a category like that.
What did you think of Madeline Marie O'Hare, and were there any other figures that you liked?
That I liked,
like David Hume or whatever.
Yeah, I know she could be kind of abrasive, but she had some good quotes, and she definitely was on a good track with what she was trying to achieve. She was out there like a front runner, definitely. And as far as other characters, I don't know.
Did I say characters?
I did. I don't know if you did, but like other people, I suppose, that are in the, I think, there's all kinds of contributions that are made. I like the contributions that most of the people make. I like the idea of, Richard Dawkins kind of using his biology degree to sort of step out and put himself out there, where a lot of people that are involved in the sciences are kind of back off of that, So he took a lot of heat for being willing to lend his credentials to the idea that religious claims were out of line, where a lot of his colleagues wouldn't dare step up and do anything similar. Science has a very tenuous relationship with religion, because science very often is publicly funded. So you have a situation where you don't want to compromise your public funding by being too loud and obnoxious, where huge public interests lie, even if those public interests, even if the public interests themselves are pretty heinous toward your profession and toward your particular field. You still kind of have to grin and bear it publicly, because you can't compromise that funding, right? So you sit there and you keep your mouth shut, but then privately over drinks you bitch about these religious people who are, completely destroying, the future generations and their understanding of what you do. And it's just a sad situation that we don't value that enough to not have it contingent on the court of public opinion.
What do you think of like the scientists who, like, for example, a Ken Miller, like someone who understands evolution, really understands really as much as we should know about science, I guess, and they still come away. They still come away a churchgoer or a Christian or whatever.
Yeah, and when you look at what they're publishing, they're not publishing anything to support their belief in God, right? I mean, they're not publishing their research papers showing that their belief is valid via their field of expertise. So what you've got is somebody who is basically saying, in my field of expertise, I do not see that there is really evidence for this, and yet I can't stop believing it, right? And that's just sort of, I guess, an emotional thing. And I suppose it would be like somebody who loves their spouse a lot and you show them hotel receipts and photos of their spouse out at dinner with, and they're still just like, no, my wife would never cheat on me. My husband would know, I know he's faithful. He would never do such a thing. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, if that's what that's what you believe, I suppose. But no amount of evidence is going to sway some people. And it's just a very ingrained emotional thing. And it's an ingrained emotional thing because if it was evidence-based, somebody like Ken Miller would be able to clearly demonstrate that. As he hasn't, I'm going to say that he can't, because I think if he could, he would. And so even he is kind of making a statement through not actually publishing his proof of God, or whatever you want to call it, that there isn't one, that this is just a feeling that he's working with.
The first person that I knew who was an atheist, he was kind of a childhood friend, and I'm very close to New York City, so 9/11 really hit home, and the topic of there being the Muslims who thought if they do this act of violence, they're going to get like virgins in heaven. And my friend used to say, the joke's on them because, like they don't, he used to say exactly, he would say, they don't even get a chance to be disappointed. And I would always think, like, don't you wish they could be? It meant that there's another, even if it meant, I had one person say that you have like 1 hour of an afterlife and you could at least see that you were wrong. Don't you wish they could be disappointed?
Yeah, I wish they would be disappointed before they kill people.
Yeah.
I wish they would understand before they kill anybody that they're wrong instead of after. But I actually saw kind of a interesting meme today. It was some kind of a military meme, and I can't remember exactly how they worded it, but it was like the 72 Virgin dating service, and it was like a military photo of guys in like military gear, like U.S. military gear, and basically the idea, I guess, that they were going to go out and kill terrorists. It was like a special ops kind of thing.
That is funny.
And so they had labeled their little photo of the military guys, our heavily armed military guys, as the 72 Virgin dating service.
That is pretty funny.
Wow, it's harsh, but yeah.
This will be my last question then, if you want to ask me one. But we had a very interesting situation in my state. One of the political parties wanted to legalize prostitution. They had a couple reasons. First of all, they wanted to make the women safer because a lot of times they're beaten up, and we've even had unfortunately some murders and everything. And they had this idea to regulate it, to have them checked for diseases and everything, and to keep them safe. So if they get assaulted, they can go to the cops like anyone else. But the religious right stepped in and said, it's unholy, it's anti-God or whatever. I'm sure you're familiar. What would be what would be your criteria for that decision? Should we think, I always jokingly ask, should we think about what God wants? But
Well, first of all, this is just one more example of how people can behave immorally and somehow come out of it thinking that they're morally superior. So here they are intervening in an initiative to try to make people safer and basically trying to endorse a system where the people are demonstrably being harmed. And they want to keep that in play, right? Because in religion, it benefits you to make sure that people pay through the nose when they don't behave like you want them to. So anytime somebody is doing something that your religion says is wrong, you want to make sure that the consequences are as bad as they possibly can be for the people. So you want to make sure that You want to restrict access to birth control. You want to restrict access to abortion. You want to restrict all of these things that would be like behaviors that would, in anybody else's mind, mitigate harmful risk. And in their mind, it's mitigating responsibility, right? So for the normal human being, the idea of saying, I would like to avoid an unwanted pregnancy is avoiding a lot of harm and problems down the road. It would be considered a responsible decision. But to many religious people, oh, you just want to sin and you don't want to have consequences, right? And it's like, well, do you say that to people to put on a safety belt when they go driving? Do you say to them, oh, yeah, you just want to drive around and avoid the consequence of dying should you get into an accident? I mean, yeah, you just don't want to be responsible, right? That's why you use that safety belt, because you just want to be irresponsible, and if you get into an accident, you're not going to die. I mean, it's ridiculous. You would think that was completely ludicrous as somebody who actually thought that. Mitigating risk, right, for people, mitigating harm and risk should always be a priority. We should always be doing things that make people safer and make people suffer less. But in religion, they only care about you not suffering if you're doing what they say you should be doing. If you're doing something outside of the religious prescription, they want it to be as horrible as possible for you, because then they get to point at it and say, see, this is why it's so bad. Yeah, because you made it bad, right? You did everything in your power to make it horrible. And then when it was the horrible that you made it, you then want to say that that's just how it is. No, you're creating these horrors. Your immoral religion and your immoral attitudes are actually breeding harm and breeding problems, and you use that to try and then show how prop up yourself as better for not living that way, instead of allowing people to be safer and healthier and happier. They can't have that, because you can't have people doing things that aren't what your religion says. If your religion says it's bad and people go out and do it, and they're not dying, and they're not being beat up, and they're not getting an STD, well, then how do you justify yourself, right?
Right.
So you have to make sure people are getting STDs, are getting beat up and murdered, because that shows you're right? You're more moral. Your morality is so much better. And so to me, they are just disturbed. I mean, that to me is like a disturbed attitude, especially when you can have those attitudes of trying to breed that kind of hateful, anti-human harm, and then turn around and call yourself moral. That takes balls of brass. I mean, I don't even know how they can do that and keep a straight face. But they do. And somewhere in their sick, twisted minds, they believe that they are better people and that you are evil because you would like to not see prostitutes murdered, right?
Yeah,
You're the wicked one.
I'm going to show them your response. Well, I do very much appreciate it. First of all, if you wanted to ask me any questions, you could if you'd like. I mean,
no, it was a very interesting discussion. I'm glad I participated. It's been fun.
I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for responding to the email. Hopefully you get a chance to check out the channel and everything. And if you had any final statements, otherwise I was going to stop recording or whatever.
That's fine. No, I think it's good. And thank you again for having me on.
No problem. We appreciate it. Okay.